All right, if it doesn't work, then I will just delete it. All right, so going through the Cold War reading. So the article investigates the notion of Cold War culture by discussing Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 classic Rear Window, focusing on spatiality and paranoia. So let's talk about those two words first of all. What do we mean by paranoia? That's the easy one.
People being afraid.
Yeah, and really suspicious and always fearing the worst, that people are like out to get them or they're watching them. Spatiality, it's interesting how they're defining that. It's basically, I think they're looking at the idea of your space around you, you know, and feeling that perhaps, you know, it's not as secure or private as you would hope it to be, that people are watching you. So the cinematic screen is seen as a site where socio-cultural conflict is negotiated and political reality is transcoded into fictional narratives. So some really good language there to adopt for the essay writing. What do you think they're meaning by socio-cultural conflict?
The different values such as communists and capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And so the political reality obviously is what's happening at the time, transcoded, being sort of interpreted as this fictional narrative. So often people talk about Rear Window as being an allegory, you know, so it's this fiction but representing a greater political reality. And there's a reading in the Dropbox that is called Rear Window Critical Allegory. So that's a good one to follow up from here to, you know, see how they've talked about it there as well. So over and beyond the body of criticism that discusses the movie as a prime example of scopophilia. So what do you think scopophilia is? When we normally see philia in a word, do you know what that means? Philia? I think philia is actually love.
Oh, all right.
I think. Because like with
yeah.
With also pedophile, it's like love for child. What do you think the scopo would be? Love for...
watching.
Yeah, I'd say that as well, because you've got periscope, telescope. So let's have a look at what they've got here. Is deriving pleasure from looking. So that's another good word to prevent from saying voyeurism all the time. And then they're looking here at cinematic self-reflexivity. So reflexivity in this context, well, they talk about it as being referring back to yourself. So obviously this could be a way at looking back at individual actions, but also looking back at the actions of society. So, yeah, so we've got some amazing words that are coming through here, but we will take a while to talk about them because then you can use them in your essay as well and make it sound extra hardcore. So, we're looking at how they combine extra-diegetic politics with intra-diegetic aesthetics. Now, have we all talked about diegetic and non-diegetic sound before?
Yes.
So what's diegetic sound?
Sound that's actually being made
Inside it, yeah, whereas non-diegetic is sort of outside and added. So I'm imagining that when they talk about extra-diegetic politics and intra, which is normally inside, diegetic aesthetics, they're talking about the politics outside the film and the aesthetics, the visuals inside the film. But let's check that. So extra-diegetic. Okay, extra-diegetic is, diegesis. Diegesis is a style of fiction of storytelling that shows an interior view of a world, but extra-diegetic is presenting a narrative, interesting. Oh yeah, basically depicting a world in a work or narrative art. Interesting. An extra-diegetic narrator is one who narrates a story from outside the fictional universe. Okay, I might jump into here. This one looks like it's going to show the distinguishment. Okay, let's have a look. So yeah, this is what I thought, because this person's saying at first glance, intra seems to indicate something internal, extra shows external, and diegetic is this type of storytelling, specifically the act of describing things rather than showing them. Intra-diegetic it says it's inside the narrative. So, for example, can be told through a character, a narrator, or something that exists inside the story, which is what I thought. Extra diegetic, it says, is when you kind of tell it as an outsider, so third person omniscient. So, interesting. It almost sounds like in the paper that when they say extra diegetic politics, that's the narrative occurring outside the film, like we thought. Intradiegetic aesthetics, being told from inside the film. What's your understanding of aesthetics?
Something that's nice looking.
Nice looking, yeah. So it's about the appreciation of beauty or art. But I think that, outward appearance, but I think that it's not always has to be beautiful for, you're aesthetically pleasing, but you probably have aesthetically displeasing as well. All right. So they said here that all of this emerges from a culture of McCarthyite furor, post-war anxieties regarding the millions of soldiers returning from World War II, and governmental infringement on privacy. So we've got a few things going on here. McCarthyite furor, so they're using McCarthyite as the adjective term, which you might be able to get away with. I haven't seen it before, to tell you the truth.
Yes.
Obviously, McCarthyism is more of the noun, yeah? So many words, but they're all worth getting to build our vocabulary and sound fancy. So furor is the outbreak of public anger or excitement, can be linked in with hysteria as well. So we've got a culture of hysteria created by McCarthyism. We also look at the politics of suspicion. We look at surveillance, and also apparently there were lots of anxieties, and this is, it'll go into later, from soldiers returning from World War II after the war. And I think this can relate to Jeffries. How? How do you think post-war anxieties of returned soldiers can relate to Jeffries?
In a sense, he has lost his position in society, depicted by his immobility, and he feels inferior compared to Lisa, who's capable of many things.
And we can see also that obviously he was in the war before as well, with Doyle. We can see also from his photography that he's been really close to the action. So this can actually cause a similar sort of trauma and paranoia as what returning soldiers might feel. Not only that, he's injured as well, which a lot of the returning soldiers were. So part of what Jeffries is experiencing in this film can also be emblematic of what some of those World War II soldiers would have been experiencing coming back, feeling really, really out of place, not knowing what to do with themselves, and having, because when you're in the war as well, you have to be switched on all the time because you could be attacked from any angle at any time. And so by him being so sort of, I guess, always looking out, being wary, always doing reconnaissance, can be emblematic of that as well. Okay, so they refer to the creation of the film as multiple imaginary scenes, basically fiction in film. But these scenes are subject to paranoid misreading symptomatic of American 1950s. So what they're saying is that what Jeff is doing when he looks out is doing, well, here they say a paranoid misreading, but some things, as we talked about before, are accurate, but a lot of the time he does get it wrong, and he does fear the worst, doesn't he? And that's something with paranoid thinking. When you're paranoid, you don't think, oh, somebody's out there is trying to love me, you think somebody out there is trying to get me, and when he looks at all the scenarios around him, he's always so negative. All right, so we'll head into some of these notes, but we've picked up on a lot of cool words there that you can use. See if you can slip those in some sentences. That's a secret private world you're looking into out there, Detective Doyle warns the protagonist of the movie, LB Jeff Jeffries. Handicapped after a severe accident in a car race, Jeff has been wheelchair-bound for weeks and left to observe his neighbours across an almost enclosed Greenwich Village courtyard. He ignores his friend's objections, and together with his girlfriend, Lisa Fremont, continues spying on one of his neighbours, Ms. Lonely Hearts, who's returning home with a young man. The promising scene is soon interrupted as he forces himself onto her, not Jeffries, but the visitor, and she subsequently throws him out. Ashamed by their having witnessed this private episode, Lisa closes the blinds and announces that the show's over for tonight and presents a preview of coming attractions in the form of an elegant nightgown. As she returns to the room in her new garment, a woman's cry pierces through the night. Lisa hastily opens one of the blinds, and for the first time in the movie, after more than 80 minutes have elapsed, the camera is actually located outside of Jeff's apartment and frames the two in the window. That's interesting that it was 80 minutes in and the camera hasn't been outside. But I don't remember that moment, seeing Jeff and Lisa from outside.
There's one of the stills that...
Oh, that was in the sack. Oh, okay. So obviously quite significant, isn't it? But it's interesting as well, all that cinema talk from shows over, and then, you know, she sort of, you know, shows what's sort of next and that kind of thing, all like it's a movie. But I think somehow the camera obviously going outside the window brings it back into reality to show that this isn't just a show, you know. Well, not for them, for us it is, but for them it's not just a show. There's stuff that's actually going on, sinister stuff. All right, so the description of this short scene points to two decisive issues at stake in Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window: spectatorship and surveillance. So the spectatorship is sort of, I guess they're kind of similar in a way. Like, spectatorship is sort of normally watching for pleasure. Surveillance is normally watching to form some kind of judgment or something like that. But they're both intertwined. Indeed, the spatial, again using the word spatial, what definition did we come up there with spatial?
Not as secure.
I'm just going to double check that one, because for me spatial is just a fancy way of saying space. Spatiality. Yeah, so it's not necessarily not secure. Their space is not as secure. The core definition of it is just relating to or occupying space. But of course, in this context, the spaces are invaded by this lack of privacy. But the spatial givens, as well as the close alignment of the camera to the protagonist, create a world that narrates and visualizes that of a voyeur observing his neighbors in excess. As has been suggested by a large body of research on Hitchcock and this particular film, the audience is heavily implicated in the protagonist's illicit spying, which we've talked about before, the fact that the audience is complicit and involved in the spying. The complicity in the voyeuristic peeping, however, goes far beyond a self-reflexive gesture. So it goes far beyond seeing that you yourself have voyeuristic potential, that equates the spectator with Jeff and the cinematic screen with the neighbour's windows, because that's the surface value, isn't it? His windows are kind of like our cinema screen, and him watching them is kind of like us watching him. But they say it goes beyond this self-reflexive gesture. Many critics fail to take into account the significance of the very moment in which the camera, for the first time in the movie, is positioned in a location markedly outside the visual field of the protagonist. On the diegetic level, a neighbour's dog, which is regarding to the narrative, a neighbour's dog has been murdered, which is why the entire neighbourhood has been brought to their balconies, with the exception of Lars Thorwald, Jeff's nemesis, and the propeller of the main narrative, the murder plot. On a meta level, so what do we mean by meta?
In terms of
it's sort of outside looking in. Yeah. So like meta language is language about language. Yes. A meta play is a play about a play. So it's something that looks in on its own form, whereas diegetic we know is inside the film, inside the narrative. So on a meta level, the protagonist has actually lost his privileged position, and the issue of spectatorship needs to be discussed is rendered considerably more complicated. So until this point, it was just a case of watching and speculating, But this makes it very real that actual harm is occurring, even with regards to watching that incident with Ms. Lonely Hearts. She didn't get hurt at the end of the day, but when something happens and we've got this scream and something bad has happened, it becomes very real, and that's when you actually have to consider your relationship to the outside world. All right, so the paper that we're going through seeks to discuss the issues of spectatorship and surveillance in the context of the Cold War and its cultural implications. First, the question of invading and observing private spheres is highly contemporary, which means current and relevant to that period in time, in that the film takes place at a historical moment where American-Soviet tensions have fostered a climate of intense suspicion and anxiety about individuals and the nation's identity. So because of this tense period in the Cold War, people are having to discuss what everyone's values are. Are they communist? Are they capitalist? But also consider what their country actually stands for. And in most cases, you've got the political parties trying to preserve the nation's identity and not have individuals' interests sort of impact upon that. So the figure of Jeff, they're going to have a look. In this piece, they're going to examine how he's like a wounded veteran, serving as a vivid reminder of the millions of soldiers who returned to the United States after World War II, and also their nervousness about their reintegration in this homecoming. Jeff's intense occupation with his neighbours seems to be a substituting act for something that he remains unaware of, but that the narrative, both in terms of story and images, declares as a traumatic memory of the war. So that's that idea that him constantly looking out, being paranoid, is symptomatic of like a returning soldier, as we said before. By trying to solve an alleged murder case, the protagonist attempts to reinstate his agency, his control, his ability to control the world around him. So let's go through and actually define agency there. So yeah, they just basically says that, a thing or person, they act to produce a particular result. So it is having a sense of control over what you're doing. And so he's trying to piece everything together, perhaps as he's trying to piece sort of his life back together as well, after everything that he's witnessed and maybe some lingering trauma. And that might also explain why he's so desperate to be proven right, like in front of Doyle, because it's like he needs his world to make sense, So Jeff's very concerned about losing his agency and his control, particularly because of his physical disposition as well. His anxiety is also closely connected to his girlfriend Lisa. Her mobility and autonomy, the fact that she can move around and she's independent, contrasts starkly with his stasis and incapacity. So the fact that he can't move, and as well as that he's sort of incapable of doing certain things. And we can really see that through how Stella has to look after him all the time. Both narrative strands, the murder and the love plot, are governed by a theoretical token of paranoia, a means to render highly complex relations coherent. So what they're saying there is the love and the murder thing is trying to make sense of complications, as well as to affirm, so strengthen, the subject's autonomy, their independence, in the face of a great danger. So we can look at that from Jeff's perspective and Lisa's perspective. Jeff being obsessed with the case in order to piece everything together and get control over his world. Lisa also sees this relationship slipping out of her fingers, and so she seeks to piece all of that back together, to figure out Jeff, to make it all work. So this paranoia will become a fruitful tool to theorize the issues outlined in the context of post-war America. So, okie dokie. So, as the humanities took a cultural turn in the mid-1980s to take a closer look at the Cold War, so by that people who were analysing this literature, more and more critics became interested in how propaganda and psychological warfare affected the home fronts, both in America and the Soviet Union, and how cultural output influenced the perception of ideology and national characteristics. So in other terms, when literary critics started to look back on these works, they wanted to see or derive, because you can look at, literature is like the cultural products of the past, do you know what I mean? And by picking apart literature, sometimes you can find a lot about what society valued at the time or what they were thinking at the time. So therefore, they want to look at this literature and try to understand how propaganda, which is all the messages from politics and that kind of thing, as well as psychological warfare, which is a little bit more complex, but don't worry too much about that, affected the thinking of the nation, affected the thinking of the citizens. And so therefore they look at Rear Window to be a symbol of that because it was produced in the Cold War era. Robert Korber was one of the earliest cultural analysts to draw an extensive connection between post-war American politics, liberal intellectualism, to use his phrase, and the cultural production of ideology. We'll come back to that in a second. He argues that the hegemony of the social welfare state, that is to say the legacy of the New Deal, could not easily be upheld after the economic recuperation from the Depression following World War II. We'll go through this step by step, which is why the influence of the ruling liberal elite had to be applied not only in defence against conservatives and the more radical left, but also in fields other than politics. So we're going to go through that step by step. So the first thing to understand there is that there was a depression following World War II. Now, I can't remember what the New Deal was, so I'm going to put that in here. I think it was something by... what's his face? Yeah, Roosevelt. So he created this program and these projects during the Great Depression called the New Deal. And what the aim was to restore prosperity to Americans. So when he took office in 1933, he really acted very swiftly to stabilise the economy and try to provide jobs and relief to those who were suffering. So if we look at... Rear Window was 50s, wasn't it?
Yes.
50... No. Rear Window... Hitchcock. Okay, 1954. Okay, so the Depression has sort of been and gone. When did the Depression end, by the way? When did the Great Depression end? 1939. So the New Deal has occurred. There's been some degree of economic recuperation. Now, which is why the influence of the ruling liberal elite had to be applied not in defence against conservatives, more left. They, liberal intellectuals. Okay, so who do you perceive liberal intellectuals to be?
McCarthy.
Interesting. McCarthy, I think they would say would be a conservative.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's weird, we get confused because liberals in America are regarded to be kind of left-wing. Mm-hmm. Republicans are their conservative right-wing. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Australia, our Liberal Party is right-leaning, which is conservative-leaning, and our Labor Party is our left-wing party. Okay. But the word liberal in general actually kind of means freedom. So if we have a look here... so open to new ideas, willing to respect or accept behaviour or opinions different from one's own, like being really open-minded, yeah? Sorry, one second. But our Liberal Party, since they're the conservative side, are actually more closed-minded. Okay. But they're what they call the Republicans or the conservatives in America. Now, what you've got, so Liberal Party in America, or the Liberals in America, which is the Democratic Party, okay, they're slightly left-leaning, but the radical left, the hardcore left, is like communism and socialism. Okay. So people who are really radical left-wing, they wanted things like communism and socialism. People who are involved in the arts, okay, like literature, movies, film, all that sort of thing, they're normally left-leaning. People who are artistic are normally have a strong sense of empathy. Do you know what I mean? Because obviously to create art, to create films, you've got to understand people, and get into different lives and have an open-mindedness and be creative. People who are right-leaning, and this is all generalizations, but people who are right-leaning and conservative are more focused on traditional values. So they're people who might be more interested in history instead of literature. Do you know what I mean? Because history is like facts. Well, they are actually not 100% facts because we already know that history can be rewritten and things like that. And the left-leaning will be into literature, storytelling, imagination. Artists will generally be left-leaning, whereas mathematicians, economists, scientists will tend to be more right-leaning, depending on their field of science. So, for example, people who are in biology, things like global warming and stuff, they'll be more left-leaning generally, because conservative parties normally value the economy over the world and nature. So, McCarthy, wanting to maintain traditional values and things like that, would have been more right-leaning. Right-leaning is generally capitalism, and the extreme right-leaning is when you've got fascism. So fascism is like what happened in Germany, where you've got a dictator, everything's super strict, hierarchical, stuff like that. Socialism on the extreme left, everything's sort of even. All right, so if McCarthy is valuing traditional values, wanting to keep the status quo, not wanting things to change, where would the filmmakers and the authors and the writers sit?
On the left.
On the left, yes. And that's why they're also easy targets to accuse of being communists, because the communist is obviously far left, yeah? So what Americans refer to these filmmakers as being, they call them liberal intellectuals. So intellectuals obviously meaning that, you know, they're quite educated, stuff like that, high thinking. Liberal, the freedoms. People often accuse universities of manufacturing left-leaning individuals, social justice warriors and things like that. But for me, being left-leaning myself, I find it kind of like funny that it's the educated people who end up on the left sometimes. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like it's when you're open-minded, it's when you're educated that you're able to see, you know, that people should be treated with equality, etc., etc. Anyway, so during this period where the Great Depression and the New Deal had already happened following World War II, there was a real push from both the conservatives, the people wanting to maintain, you know, the way America has always been, and the more radical left, who had seen all this social upheaval around the world and were inspired by ideas of Marxism and stuff like that. So these liberal intellectuals like Hitchcock and any filmmakers, writers, this was a period where they really wanted to reassert their values. And the only way to really do that, to control the way Americans thought and lived in relationship to the world, was to reach them on a cultural as well as the political level to get their support. Do you know what I mean? So, for example, some of the crises that affect our world to this day are like refugee crises. And there's this great, South African director who did District 9, and he also did Elysium, and they were quite high-grossing films. His name is Neil Blomkamp. Those films, like, they're both like to do with outer space. Like, one sort of aliens on Earth, the other one is like these two different planets, blah, blah, blah. They're all strong political messages about refugees. And they're so effective in what they do. So during this period, not just Rear Window, but also The Crucible, also On the Waterfront, they're all texts that basically were the director or the author's way of trying to spread their cultural reality, their views of how things ought to be. So texts like Rear Window can be seen to be a pushback or a negotiation between the opposing forces of far-left radical ideas and the constraints of conservative thinking. I'll give you a moment to jot that down. Okay. So, building on this analysis, Gordon Johnston presents a useful study describing the mechanisms that posed a broader set of questions about patterns of behaviour, attitudes and structures of thought and meaning associated with the Cold War. He describes this as Cold War culture, so we could consider Rear Window to be a part of that. This theoretical token signals a shift from a predominantly instrumental understanding of culture to an active one, focusing on culture as a sphere that both produces and negotiates meaning. So what they're saying there is, rather than seeing films like Rear Window as just being reflective of a period, it's actually a film that can produce meaning and negotiate meaning, which means persuade. So we're not meant to see these texts as just being reflective or informative, but ones that actually have power in themselves to change cultural thinking. For the director, I guess, to get his messages out there and get people to respond accordingly. So therefore, instead of thinking about the Cold War as being something that intrudes on the cinematic screen, that influences it, it's actually more productive to think of the Cold War as a cultural site, something that creates culture, and also provides this space for the imaginary resolution of conflicts. So what that means is that obviously the film is the imaginary space, because it's fiction. Yeah. In this film, some of those tensions, some of those conflicts can be resolved where they can't necessarily in the real world. Yeah. So that's the director basically going, guys, can you see how this could all work? You know, we've got this heated tension, we've got the thermometer, we've got, you know, suspicion, paranoia. If only it turned out like this, you know. And therefore, by watching that imaginary space, by watching it in cinema, we're actually, you know, digesting a message about how to resolve some of these real-world tensions. So this site, this cultural site of the Cold War, displaces the principal conflict by transcoding socio-political reality into narratives that play out this conflict as the tension and resolution between fictional characters. So fantastic language to use, but it says exactly what I said before, which is just basically transcoding. If I give you the definition of that, it's like a fancy way of saying coding, really. Because so to convert language or information from one coded representation to another. So from physical reality over to film. So it's just a way of putting this conflict in film and, through the characters. Rather than providing a direct mimetic representation of a given conflict, so mimetic comes from the word mime, which means to sort of like copy, mimic and copy. What fiction does is it reworks and refigures them, so it changes them into a totally different format. Therefore, the premise of this article is that Rear Window is a prime example of a cultural product that negotiates socio-political concerns of the 1950s by means of displacing the actual conflict onto the cinematic screen, which in turn features a narrative that repeatedly redeploys thematic issues to substitute sites. So they're just getting fancy in their wording there. It's just meaning the same thing as before. Put the conflict into the cinema screen and play out the themes and issues. Okay, so the aspect of observation and spectatorship is certainly part of the most well-researched aspects of Rear Window. And the whole voyeurism, spectating thing, that's definitely going to be, I think, featured in your exam. As early as 1960, Jean Duché proposes in Hitch et son public to conceive of Jeff as a projector, producing its own cinema onto the opposite wall by observing his neighbours. So like a film projector that, you know, sort of shows what's happening. He's like that. And the reason why he projects rather than observes is why. Why can he be regarded as a projector and not just a cinema person? So Jeffrey, he's sitting there, he's watching this stuff going on. A projector is one that actually casts the image rather than someone who's sitting there just passively viewing it. Why could he be regarded as a projector and not just a viewer?
Because we are only able to see what he...
Yes, there's that. But also because he's actually crafting his own perspective as well. Okay. Because when he's watching the people, he's making all his little assumptions, isn't he? Yeah. So for him, the pianist is in an unhappy relationship and is you know, playing this song because he's so unhappy with the relationship. The newlyweds are unhappy. Miss Lonely Hearts is unhappy, you know, and Thorwald's murdering his wife. So... he's a projector in that he's pushing his assumptions, his views, onto what he sees before him, interpreting it. If he was a passive viewer, those messages would be fed to him. But no, he's actually crafting his own picture. Something that other characters like Doyle and Stella and Lisa try to provide another perspective of. Okay, ocular vocabulary and cinematic analogies. So let's have a look at ocular. To do with the eyes. So vocabulary to do with the eyes and looking, as well as cinematic analogies. They've obviously been around in critical analysis for a long time. Robert Stamm and Roberta Pearson note the title Rear Window, apart from the literalness of its denotation, evokes the diverse windows of the cinema. So there are many different windows in the cinema. You've got the camera, the lens of camera and projector. You also have a window in the projection booth as well. Have you seen those before?
Yeah,
the back of the cinema, yeah. The eye is also regarded as a window into the soul, and film itself as being a window on the world. So you got all those?
Yeah.
Milan Bozovic equates Jeff's darkened living room with a camera obscura. As for Jeff's function in this highly cinematic diegesis, critics note with a fair amount of consistency that he's closely aligned with, and thus implicates, the traditional film spectator in his illicit peeping on others. So the two things there is Jeff can be regarded as like the camera, or he can be regarded as the spectator.
Okay.
You know, so like we said before, when you look inside a camera as well, it's pitch black when you look inside the lens, because of the way that cameras actually make their images through the input of light. So the fact that he is in a darkened room can represent the room of the cinema, but it can also represent the dark interior of the camera.
Okay.
And that's interesting as well when it comes down to the fact that his camera is broken open, isn't it? Because that can almost be a symbol for the fact that we're seeing inside the camera in this whole film. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Moreover, since he's so active in constructing various narratives underlying his neighbour's doings, for Stan Pearson, he clearly functions as a substitute director or auteur. Now, I'm just going to get you the definition of auteur.
Is it like a director?
I think so, yeah. Oh, a film director who influences their film so much that they actually become their author.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's an interesting term there, because some directors obviously are just trying to bring a screenplay to life. Some of them have so much input that they literally craft the meaning of the film, which I think we can regard Hitchcock as being, because this is his film, so much so that he's even in it, you know. So what we've got there is that Jeff, of course, can be more than just an observer. He can actually be a director because of the fact that or even auteur, because he's crafting this narrative that goes with it. Bozovic's image of a camera obscura. Now let's talk about obscura there for a second as well, because these are all good terms that if you use, makes you sound very fancy. Camera obscura, from Latin meaning dark room, chamber or room. Also referred to as a pinhole image. It's the natural optical phenomenon that occurs with an image of a scene. Hold up, I have to open the link. All right, so the image of a scene on the other side of the screen is projected through a small hole in that screen as a reversed and inverted image, left to the right and upside down, on a surface opposite to the opening. The surroundings of the projected image have to be relatively dark for the image to be clear. So many historical camera obscura experiments were performed in dark rooms. It refers to the constructions or devices that make use of the principle of bringing that image in and inverting it inside a box, tent or room, which he's doing. So what have we got? Drawing, painting, the obscura box, photographic. There's means to study eclipses. So it's interesting because obviously we know that obscure means to kind of distort an image. And a camera obscura, not only does the image come in, but it's flipped. So that particular term can also relate to the fact that Jeff doesn't always get things right. He's in his dark room, the image is coming in, but maybe it's getting somewhat distorted. Okay. And of course, this term camera obscura and the camera motif relates a lot to Jeff's actual occupation. So what Bozovic points out is that what unfolds in the room on this side of the window is precisely the inverted image of what unfolds beyond the window of the flat on the opposite side of the courtyard, the Thor world's flat. So that's something to look into a bit more with that regard of inverted, because I don't know if it's inverted altogether because, oh, wait, interesting. Think about this for one moment just to interpret that, which is that obviously what happens in Thor world's thing is we have a troubled marriage that falls apart and digresses into sort of murder and it all falls to bits, right? What we have on Jeff's side is a troubled relationship that actually becomes better and stronger, and closer. So in that sense, that fulfills that camera obscura definition, because what's happening between Jeff and Lisa is somehow the inversion of what's happening between Mr. and Mrs. Thorwald. So that's an interesting sort of observation there. All right, so unfortunately, that is where we need to leave that one for now, but there's so much to discuss, isn't there? And so much rich content. So I will... How many pages am I into that? I'm into... Not very far. I will set myself, because I don't think... I only have like one emergency marking tonight. I will set myself a goal to try and do a follow-up recording tonight. And another one before the end of the week so you can really get that Cold War insight.